As you settle into your own peaceful darkness this evening, let Amara's courage linger in your thoughts. A reminder that in every age, there come moments when we must choose between comfortable lies and dangerous truths, between survival and integrity, between the approval of the powerful and the whispered gratitude of history itself. As Amara languished in her stone cell beneath the temple of Amoniasere, her desperate act of hidden truth-telling echoed across the vast expanse of human history like ripples spreading from a stone cast into still water. For her story was not unique to ancient Egypt, nor limited to the particular cruelties of pharaonic rule. Across continents and centuries, in civilizations that would rise long after the pyramids had already stood for millennia, scribes would face the same soul-crushing choice between survival and integrity, between the comfortable lies that preserved their lives and the dangerous truths that honored their humanity. Let your mind drift now across these broader currents of human experience, where the written word became simultaneously humanity's greatest tool for preserving wisdom and its most effective weapon for destroying inconvenient realities. In every corner of the ancient world, in courts both magnificent and modest, the same drama played out with depressing regularity. Power demanded that history serve its interests, and those who held the stylus, quill, or brush found themselves transformed from chroniclers into accomplices. In the marble halls of imperial Rome, where the echoes of senators' speeches mingled with the whispered plots of ambitious generals, a historian named Gaius Cornelius Tacitus faced his own version of Amara's dilemma. The year was 115 CE, and the Emperor Trajan had just returned from his campaigns in Dacia, laden with gold and trailing thousands of enslaved prisoners. The Senate had voted him a triumph. The crowds had cheered his procession through the streets, and the court historians had been commissioned to immortalize his achievements for posterity. But Tacitus, whose keen eye had witnessed the realities behind Rome's imperial glory, struggled with the gap between public celebration and private truth. He had seen the dispatches that never reached the Senate, documents describing the systematic torture of captured Dacian nobles who had refused to reveal the locations of their treasure hoards. He knew about the deliberate destruction of Dacian temples and the forced relocation of entire populations to prevent future resistance. Most troubling of all, he was aware of the emperor's private doubts about the campaign's strategic value, doubts that contradicted the narrative of inevitable Roman triumph being carved into triumphal arches across the empire. Writing during what would later be called the height of Roman civilization, Tacitus developed an almost supernatural ability to tell the truth through misdirection and implication. His accounts of imperial excesses were masterpieces of subtle subversion, appearing to praise while actually condemning, seeming to celebrate while quietly mourning. When describing the conquest of Britain under previous emperors, he wrote of Roman forces creating a wasteland and calling it peace, a phrase that appeared to glorify Roman efficiency while actually indicting the brutality of imperial expansion. His survival depended on this delicate balance. Emperors like Trajan, while more reasonable than predecessors like Caligula or Nero, still maintained networks of informers who monitored literary output for signs of disloyalty. Writers who crossed the line too obviously simply disappeared, their works confiscated and their names added to the growing list of those who had chosen poorly between truth and survival. Meanwhile, in the sun-baked courts of Damascus and Baghdad, where the desert winds carried both the scent of spices from distant lands and the whispered fears of those who served the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphs, scribes faced their own particular form of literary terrorism. Abd al-Rahman ibn Khalil, a court chronicler serving Caliph Harun al-Rashid in 803 CE, found himself tasked with an assignment that would test both his scholarly integrity and his Islamic faith. The caliph, despite his later reputation as the enlightened ruler featured in the 1001 Nights, was deeply insecure about his family's claim to leadership of the Islamic world. His ancestors had seized power through political maneuvering and military force, but legitimacy in Islamic society required demonstrable dissent from the Prophet Muhammad or his companions. The historical record, however, was frustratingly honest about the Abbasids' actual origins as ambitious merchants and minor officials who had skillfully exploited political chaos to advance their own interests. Abd al-Rahman's assignment was to clarify the genealogical records, transforming the caliph's merchant ancestors into heroic companions of the Prophet, their commercial success reframed as rewards for early conversion to Islam and faithful service to the nascent Muslim community. The work required not just creative writing, but the systematic alteration of existing documents and the creation of fictional eyewitness accounts that would support the new narrative. The penalty for refusal was death by beheading, carried out publicly in the courtyard of the Great Mosque as a lesson to other scholars who might be tempted to prioritize historical accuracy over political convenience. But perhaps even more terrifying was the religious dimension of the threat. By refusing the caliph's commission, Abd al-Rahman risked being branded as an enemy of Islam itself, his execution justified as the elimination of someone who had dared to question divinely ordained authority. As he worked through the night in his lamplit study, surrounded by the astronomical instruments and mathematical texts that had made Baghdad the intellectual center of the Islamic world, Abd al-Rahman crafted fictional genealogies with the same precision he applied to calculating celestial movements. Each fabricated connection to the Prophet's family was a small betrayal of the historical method he had spent his life perfecting, yet each lie potentially saved not just his own life, but those of his wife and children, who would have faced slavery or death if he had been condemned for treason. In the temple complexes of classical India, where the monsoon rains drummed against stone carvings of dancing gods and mathematical concepts that would not reach Europe for centuries, scholars faced their own version of this eternal conflict. During the reign of Chandragupta II in the early 5th century CE, court astronomer Varahamihira found himself caught between scientific observation and religious orthodoxy in ways that would have been familiar to Galileo a millennium later. The Brahmin priests who controlled religious education had developed elaborate cosmological models based on sacred texts, describing a universe with the Earth supported by cosmic serpents and surrounded by layers of celestial spheres. These models were considered divinely revealed truth, integral to Hindu religious practice and social order. But Varahamihira's careful observations of planetary movements and star positions revealed mathematical patterns that contradicted the priestly cosmology in fundamental ways. When the king commissioned a comprehensive astronomical text that would demonstrate the superiority of Indian knowledge to foreign visitors from China and Persia, Varahamihira faced an impossible choice: publish his accurate observations and face accusations of heresy that could result in exile from the scholarly community and loss of royal patronage, or compromise his scientific integrity to preserve religious harmony. His solution was a masterwork of careful ambiguity. The text he produced contained layers of meaning, surface descriptions that satisfied religious authorities, while embedding mathematical relationships that careful readers could decode to understand the true nature of planetary motion. Future astronomers would spend centuries unraveling the coded truths he had hidden within apparently orthodox religious descriptions, his survival strategy becoming a blueprint for scholars across cultures who faced similar pressures. Even the rainforests of Mesoamerica, where Maya scribes worked by torchlight in limestone palaces decorated with intricate calendrical calculations, the same deadly dynamic played out between truth and power. In the city-state of Copen during the 8th century CE, the scribe known to us only as Serpent Scroll, his Mayan name lost to time, served the ruler 18 Rabbit, whose military campaigns had brought the city unprecedented wealth and territorial expansion. But 18 Rabbit's success had come at a terrible cost that contradicted the divine mandate claimed by Maya kings. Rather than the effortless victories attributed to supernatural intervention, the conquest had required brutal siege warfare that decimated civilian populations. Cities that had surrendered peacefully were nevertheless sacked to terrorize other potential enemies. Prisoners taken in battle were subjected to elaborate torture rituals that served political rather than religious purposes, their prolonged suffering designed to break the will of enemy populations. Serpent Scroll's commission was to create a comprehensive codex celebrating the king's achievements, complete with hieroglyphic inscriptions that would be carved into stone monuments throughout the realm. The work was expected to present 18 Rabbit as a semi-divine figure whose military success demonstrated the god's favor and justified the expansion of royal power over every aspect of Maya society. The consequences of producing an insufficiently flattering account were demonstrated regularly in Copen's Central Plaza, where scribes who had disappointed their royal patrons were burned alive alongside their offending manuscripts. The Maya believed that knowledge and its creator were mystically connected. Destroying both together ensured that dangerous ideas could not contaminate future generations. Yet even facing such absolute consequences, some scribes found ways to preserve fragments of truth. In monastery scriptoriums across medieval Europe, where monks labored to copy both sacred texts and secular chronicles, a tradition of resistance developed that would echo through centuries. These religious scribes, theoretically bound by vows of obedience to ecclesiastical authority, discovered that the very marginalia they added to illuminate manuscripts could serve as hiding places for suppressed information. Brother Thomas of Canterbury, working in the Abbey of Christ Church during the reign of King John in the early 13th century, became a master of this subtle art of historical preservation. While his official chronicle praised the king's efforts to defend England against French invasion and portrayed his conflicts with the Pope as necessary assertions of royal dignity, the decorative borders and margins of his manuscripts told a very different story. Hidden within elaborate illustrations of biblical scenes, coded in the positioning of ornamental letters, embedded in seemingly innocent commentary on scriptural passages, Brother Thomas preserved accounts of King John's systematic extortion of wealthy subjects, his cowardly flight from French forces, and his brutal suppression of baronial opposition. Future readers who knew how to interpret his visual language could reconstruct an accurate picture of one of England's most disastrous reigns, even while the main text sang hymns of royal virtue. This tradition of hidden truth-telling became a lifeline for historical accuracy across cultures and centuries. In China, during the Ming Dynasty's systematic suppression of record from the previous Yuan period, court historians developed elaborate systems of double meaning that allowed them to preserve forbidden information within apparently orthodox texts. Islamic chroniclers under various caliphates created similar methods for encoding criticism of rulers while maintaining surface compliance with imperial demands. These acts of quiet rebellion, like Amara's hidden scroll sealed in its ceramic jar, represented something profoundly important in human history. They were proof that even under the most oppressive circumstances, some individuals would risk everything to ensure that truth survived alongside officially sanctioned lies. These scribes became unsung heroes of human memory, their courage measured not in dramatic gestures of defiance, but in the patient, dangerous work of preserving accurate records for future generations who might never know their names. As you rest now in the comfort of your own evening, consider the debt we owe to these forgotten guardians of truth. Every honest historical account we possess, every accurate record of past events that contradicts official propaganda, represents a victory won by scribes who chose integrity over survival. Their hidden scrolls and coded marginalia, their subtle implications and careful ambiguities, created an alternative historical record that runs parallel to the official narratives carved in stone and preserved in palace archives. In Amara's darkened cell, as rats scurried across stone floors and the weight of her choices pressed down like the limestone blocks above her head, she had become part of this ancient fellowship of truth-tellers. Her hidden account of the Southern massacres, sealed away from the light but preserved for posterity, joined countless other acts of documentary courage that spanned the globe and stretched across millennia. Whether she would survive to see her truth vindicated remained to be seen, but her courage had already achieved something that transcended personal survival. She had ensured that somewhere, somehow, the real story would endure. Hashtag why scribes were forced to rewrite history or die. Introduction. The trembling hand of Amara, senior scribe to Pharaoh Akhenaten, paused above the papyrus scroll that would either secure her legacy or seal her doom. Before her lay two versions of history: the truth she had witnessed with her own eyes and the sanitized fiction her ruler demanded. Choose correctly, and she would live to see another sunrise over the Nile. Choose wrongly, and her mummified remains would join the countless other scribes who had dared to prioritize truth over survival. This moment, this terrible choice between integrity and existence, has echoed through the corridors of power for millennia, shaping the very history we think we know today. Welcome, dear listener, to another quiet evening of storytelling, where we'll unravel one of history's most dangerous professions. Whether you're curled up with a warm drink in a cottage in the Cotswolds, watching the sun set over the Mediterranean from a terrace in Santorini, or listening to rain against your window in a cozy apartment in Prague, I'm delighted you've chosen to spend this time with me. Before we delve deep into the shadowy world of ancient scribes, those keepers of collective memory who face the ultimate choice between rewriting the past or facing their own erasure, take a moment to settle in completely. Perhaps you're nestled under a soft blanket, the day's worries beginning to fade as twilight settles outside your window. Maybe you're in that perfect liminal space between day and night, when the world grows quiet and stories feel most alive. Or perhaps it's already deep into your evening, and you're seeking that gentle transition into peaceful sleep. Wherever and whenever you're joining me, know that you're part of a timeless tradition, gathering around an invisible hearth to share tales that illuminate the human condition. Tonight's story begins in the dusty scriptoriums of ancient civilizations, but its echoes reverberate through every age, including our own. We'll explore the lives of scribes, those unsung architects of recorded history, who toiled in the courts of kings, emperors, high priests, and pharaohs. These weren't merely clerks or simple record keepers. They were the gatekeepers of truth itself, wielding reed pens and quills like weapons in an endless war between fact and power. When you picture a scribe, your mind might conjure the image of a peaceful scholar bent over parchment, methodically recording the great deeds of rulers with quiet dedication. Perhaps you imagine them working by candlelight in monastery cells or in the cool shadows of palace libraries. Their work a noble pursuit of preserving human achievement for posterity. This romantic notion, while partly true, barely scratches the surface of a far more perilous reality. The truth about scribes, the one that rarely appears in history books, is that their profession was a high-stakes dance with mortality itself. Every day, they walked a razor's edge between duty to historical accuracy and loyalty to their often volatile, paranoid, and ruthless masters. A single poorly chosen word, an inconvenient truth left unredacted, or a moment of moral courage could transform a respected court recorder into a condemned traitor faster than ink could dry on papyrus. Consider the immense responsibility these individuals carried. In an age before mass literacy, before printing presses, before digital archives, scribes were the sole conduit between events and their recording for future generations. They didn't simply witness history. They literally created it through their choice of which details to include, which to omit, and which to subtly alter. The power they wielded was simultaneously immense and terrifyingly fragile. For while they could shape how future civilizations would remember the past, they remained completely at the mercy of present-day tyrants who understood exactly how dangerous an honest chronicler could be. Throughout ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, China, Greece, and Rome, countless scribes faced this same impossible choice that confronted our Mara in that pivotal moment. Write what actually happened. The military defeats disguised as victories, the famines caused by imperial incompetence, the religious persecutions carried out in the name of divine mandate, the corruption that rotted empires from within and risked torture, exile, or execution. Or bend the truth, transforming defeats into glorious campaigns, famines into minor inconveniences overcome by wise leadership, and brutal suppression into necessary acts of divine justice. The stakes were never theoretical. Palace archives across the ancient world contain chilling records of scribes who chose poorly, their fates serving as stark reminders to their successors. Some were burned alive, their final moments as agonizing as the truths they had tried to preserve. Others were buried alive with their subversive documents, their screams muffled by the same earth that would eventually swallow the civilizations they had dared to chronicle honestly. Still others simply vanished, their names scraped from official records as thoroughly as if they had never existed. The ultimate irony for those whose life's work was preserving memory. Yet perhaps the most haunting fate befell those scribes who survived their moment of choice by capitulating. They lived, yes, but they lived with the knowledge that every word they subsequently wrote was a betrayal of their deepest principles. They became architects of lies, builders of false legacies, creators of the very historical distortions that would mislead countless future generations. In choosing life over truth, they chose a particular kind of death, the slow erosion of their integrity, one falsified record at a time. As we embark together on this journey through the treacherous world of ancient scribes, I invite you to consider how their struggles resonate in our own information-saturated age. In a time when we're constantly bombarded with competing narratives, when the very concept of objective truth feels increasingly elusive, these ancient story keepers have much to teach us about courage, compromise, and the eternal tension between power and truth. So pour yourself another cup of tea, adjust your pillow, and prepare to meet remarkable individuals whose names have largely been lost to time, but whose choices shaped the very foundations of how we understand our past. Their stories of moral courage and devastating compromise, of truth preserved and truth destroyed, remind us that every generation faces its own version of Amara's terrible choice. Ready to discover how these forgotten heroes and reluctant villains shaped the history you think you know? Subscribe now and join our growing community of listeners who gather each week for these intimate explorations of humanity's hidden stories. Hit that notification bell to ensure you never miss an episode, and consider supporting this journey with a like or by sharing tonight's story with someone who appreciates the profound complexity of our shared past. Together, We'll continue uncovering the fascinating, troubling, and ultimately deeply human stories that official histories often prefer to forget. Let us begin with Amara's story and discover why, in the ancient world, truth was often the most dangerous thing anyone could dare to write. Close your eyes now and let your mind drift across the sands of time to ancient Egypt around 1200 BCE. The great city of Thebes stretches along the Nile's banks, its limestone temples catching the golden light of Ra's eternal journey across the sky. Here, under the reign of Pharaoh Ramesses III, a ruler whose very name would echo through millennia, we meet 17-year-old Amara, kneeling in the cool shadows of the House of Life, her reed pen trembling not with nervousness, but with the weight of destiny itself. Amara was an anomaly in her world, a rarity as precious and dangerous as a flawless emerald. In an age when literacy was the exclusive domain of men, when women were expected to weave linen rather than weave words, she had somehow carved out a place among the sacred scribes. Her journey to this moment began in the humble workshop of her father, a skilled artisan who carved delicate amulets for middle-class families, hoping to ensure safe passage to the afterlife. It was there, watching him etch protective spells onto scarab beetles and golden pendants, that young Amara first encountered the mysterious beauty of hieroglyphic script. While other children played with clay dolls or chased each other through the narrow streets of the artisan quarter, Amara would sit transfixed, studying the intricate symbols her father carved. She began to see patterns where others saw only decoration. The way the Eye of Horus seemed to watch her with ancient wisdom, how the Ankh symbol appeared to pulse with life itself, the graceful curves of the ibis that represented Thoth, god of wisdom and writing. What started as childhood fascination evolved into an almost supernatural ability to memorize and reproduce the complex hieroglyphic system. Her father, initially amused by his daughter's unusual interest, grew concerned as her obsession deepened. In their world, such talents in a girl were viewed with suspicion, even fear. But when Amara began spontaneously writing prayers and protective spells with accuracy that surpassed many trained scribes, word reached the House of Life. The high priest Amenhotep, keeper of sacred knowledge and overseer of scribal training, made an unprecedented decision. Despite the protests of traditionalists and the raised eyebrows of court officials, he accepted Amara as a student, the first girl to enter the hallowed halls of Egypt's most prestigious scribal school. The House of Life was no gentle academy of learning. Built within the temple complex of Karnak, its limestone walls bore witness to centuries of intellectual torture disguised as education. Here, beneath painted ceilings that depicted the journey of the sun god through the underworld, young minds were hammered into instruments of imperial will. Students began their training before dawn, when the air still held the cool kiss of desert night, and continued until long after the stars emerged to keep vigil over the Nile. Picture Amara's daily existence during those formative years. Her hands, once soft from her sheltered upbringing, became instruments of pain and perseverance. Every morning, she would grind pigments for ink, mixing soot with gum, Arabic, and water until her palms were permanently stained black and red, the colors of life and death that would define her profession. Her fingers grew callous from endless hours of preparing reed pens, splitting the stems just so, chewing the tips to create the perfect writing point, discarding dozens for everyone that met the exacting standards of her instructors. The memorization requirements were staggering. Students were expected to master over 700 hieroglyphic signs, each with multiple meanings depending on context. A single symbol might represent a sound, an idea, or serve as a determinative that clarified the meaning of an entire word. The ibis could mean the bird itself, the god Thoth, wisdom, or writing. The circle might represent the sun, the god Ra, eternity, or completion. One mistake, one confused symbol in an official document, could alter the meaning of a royal decree or, worse yet, offend the gods themselves. Physical punishment was not just expected, but considered essential to the learning process. Students who confused similar-looking symbols felt the sharp crack of wooden rulers across their knuckles. Those who failed to complete their copying exercises within the allotted time found themselves kneeling on rough stone floors for hours, their backs aching as they held heavy stone tablets above their heads. Amara, already marked as different by her gender, faced additional scrutiny. Her instructors seemed to take particular pleasure in finding fault with her work, as if her very presence challenged the natural order they were sworn to maintain. Yet she persevered, driven by dreams that sustained her through the darkest moments of training. In her mind's eye, she saw herself as a chronicler of Egypt's eternal glory, recording the pharaoh's divine wisdom, documenting the great festivals that honored the gods, preserving for future generations the magnificent achievements of the world's greatest civilization. She imagined future students reading her inscriptions thousands of years hence, marveling at the golden age she would help immortalize through her careful, honest documentation. The irony of these dreams would soon become devastatingly clear. When Amara finally took her place among the royal scribes at age 17, she discovered that the gap between her idealistic vision and harsh reality was as vast as the desert that stretched beyond Egypt's green valley. Her first assignment arrived on a morning when the Nile ran particularly high, its muddy waters promising another year of abundance, a good omen that should have filled her with joy. Instead, she felt a growing dread as the court's most senior officials gathered around her writing table. The task seemed straightforward enough. Inscribe a commemorative stela celebrating Pharaoh Ramesses III's decisive victory over the Sea Peoples, those mysterious maritime invaders who had terrorized the eastern Mediterranean and threatened Egypt's very existence. This should have been the moment of triumph she had dreamed about, recording a genuinely heroic achievement that would inspire future generations and honor the pharaoh's military genius. But as the viziers and high priests began dictating the text, Amara's heart sank with each elaborated lie. They spoke of a battle that bore no resemblance to the events she had heard whispered in the servants' quarters, the version that temple guards shared when they thought no one was listening. The truth was that Egypt had indeed repelled the Sea Peoples, but at enormous cost. The battle had raged for days, not hours. Egyptian casualties numbered in the thousands, not dozens. The enemy had penetrated far deeper into Egyptian territory than anyone wanted to admit, burning villages and temples before finally being driven back. Most troubling of all, the victory had come not through superior Egyptian strategy or divine intervention, but through desperate alliances with rival nations and costly bribes that had nearly emptied the royal treasury. Ramesses III was indeed a skilled military leader, but he was also a man who had gambled everything on one decisive engagement and barely emerged victorious. Yet the version being dictated to her transformed this hard-won survival into effortless triumph. In their retelling, the pharaoh had personally slain hundreds of enemies, his divine nature manifesting in supernatural strength that sent terror through the invaders' ranks. The Egyptian casualties disappeared entirely, replaced by tales of miraculous healings and divine protection. The costly alliances became eager tributes from lesser nations grateful to serve Egypt's glory. As you settle deeper into your evening's rest, imagine Amara in that crucial moment, her reed pen hovering over the fresh papyrus like a sword poised above her own neck. The flickering oil lamp cast dancing shadows across her young face, shadows that seemed to whisper warnings about the choice before her. In her right hand, she held the instrument of her craft, the tool that could either secure her future or seal her doom. In her heart, she carried the weight of truth itself, that dangerous burden that had already begun to crush the innocence of her dreams. She knew, with the clarity that comes only in moments of absolute crisis, that this first test would define not just her career, but her very soul. Right the lies, and she would become complicit in the systematic distortion of history that kept pharaohs in power and peoples in ignorance. Tell the truth, and she would join the anonymous ranks of scribes who had simply vanished. The silence stretched eternal as temple officials waited, their eyes boring into her like the gaze of judgmental gods. Somewhere in the distance, the Nile continued its ancient song, indifferent to the human drama playing out in its shadow. And in that suspended moment between honesty and survival, Amara made the choice that would haunt her for the rest of her days. The enhanced version transforms what was originally a brief character sketch into a fully developed dramatic narrative that sets up the larger themes about truth, power, and moral compromise that will presumably continue throughout the series. As Amara's chisel struck the final hieroglyph of her first commission lie, the sound echoed not just through the temple corridors of ancient Thebes, but across millennia and continents, joining a symphony of similar betrayals that had shaped human civilization. For her story was not unique. It was merely one thread in a vast tapestry of coercion that stretched from the ziggurats of Mesopotamia to the scriptoriums of medieval monasteries, from the imperial courts of China to the libraries of Alexandria. Let your mind wander now across this broader landscape of scribal suffering, where the act of recording history became a deadly game of survival played between truth and power. Picture, if you will, the countless writing chambers scattered across the ancient world, each one a potential crime scene where historical accuracy went to die, murdered by the very hands meant to preserve it. In the shadowy halls of Nineveh, capital of the mighty Assyrian Empire, another young scribe named Nabaramani faced his own moment of terrible choice. The year was 645 BCE, and the great king Ashurbanipal, he who would later be remembered as the last great ruler of Assyria, had just returned from a campaign against the rebellious city of Babylon. The military expedition had been, by any honest measure, a catastrophic failure. Assyrian forces had been repeatedly outmaneuvered, their supply lines cut, their siege engines destroyed by Babylonian fire ships. Thousands of Assyrian soldiers lay buried in foreign soil, their bodies food for vultures rather than recipients of proper funeral rites. But in the king's private chambers, surrounded by towering walls covered in reliefs depicting previous military triumphs, a very different version of events was being dictated to Nabaramani. In this alternate reality, Ashurbanipal had led his armies to glorious victory, personally slaying enemy champions in single combat, while divine eagles circled overhead as signs of celestial approval. The Babylonian defenders had supposedly fled in terror at the mere sight of Assyrian banners, abandoning their city to be sacked and their treasures claimed for the greater glory of Ashur, the Assyrian god of war. As the courtiers spoke these fabrications, Nabaramani's stylus grew heavy in his hand. He had trained for 15 years to reach this position, mastering not only the complex cuneiform script, but also the intricate diplomatic languages necessary for international correspondence. His father had sold the family's small olive grove to pay for his education, believing that literacy would secure his son's future in ways that farming never could. Now, listening to these elaborate lies, Nabaramani wondered if his father's sacrifice had purchased not security, but a front-row seat to his own damnation. The Assyrian court was notorious for its creative approaches to punishment. Simple execution was considered merciful. The preferred methods involved days or weeks of systematic torture designed to extract not just life, but dignity itself. Impalement was particularly favored for those who betrayed the king's trust. The victim would be slowly lowered onto a sharpened stake, the point carefully positioned to ensure maximum suffering while avoiding vital organs that might bring quick death. Some impaled scribes had reportedly lived for 3 days, their screams serving as education for their colleagues. But perhaps even worse than the threat to himself was the leverage the court held over his family. Assyrian records, preserved on clay tablets that have survived to our modern era, document cases where rebellious scribes watched their children sold into slavery or their wives given to enemy soldiers as spoils of war. One particularly chilling account describes a scribe who refused to alter a treaty that would have disadvantaged Assyria's position. His punishment was to watch his entire family executed, while scribal students were forced to document the proceedings, creating a permanent record of what happened to those who chose truth over compliance. Faced with such stakes, Nabaramani pressed his stylus into the soft clay and began inscribing the king's version of events. Each cuneiform wedge felt like a nail in the coffin of his integrity, but he comforted himself with the knowledge that at least his family would live to see another sunrise. He would spend the rest of his life perfecting the art of lying with precision, becoming so skilled at historical revision that later kings would specifically request his services for their most sensitive fabrications. The pattern repeated itself across civilizations with depressing consistency. In the monasteries of medieval Europe, where Christian scribes labored to preserve both sacred texts and secular chronicles, the pressure to manipulate history was no less intense than in pagan courts. Brother Aldrich, a Benedictine monk working in the scriptorium of Canterbury Cathedral during the turbulent reign of King Henry II, found himself facing a crisis that would test both his faith and his survival instincts. The year was 1170, and the kingdom was reeling from the brutal murder of Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, at the altar of his own cathedral. The 4 knights who had carried out the deed claimed to be acting on the king's wishes, though Henry himself vehemently denied ordering the assassination. The truth, as Brother Aldrich well knew from his position within the church hierarchy, was far more complex and damaging than either the king's denials or the knights' claims suggested. Henry had indeed expressed his desire to be rid of the troublesome archbishop, though perhaps not in terms that could be legally construed as explicit murder orders. More damaging still were the king's private letters, some of which had passed through the monastery scriptorium for copying and distribution. These documents revealed a systematic campaign to undermine Becket's authority, including attempts to bribe other bishops and threats against the archbishop's supporters. Most damning of all was correspondence suggesting that Henry had been in secret negotiations with enemies of the church, offering to reduce clerical privileges in exchange for political support. When Bishop Gilbert de Glanville arrived at Canterbury with instructions to clarify the historical record surrounding Becket's death, Brother Aldrich knew that his carefully maintained neutrality was about to be shattered. The bishop's message was elegantly phrased, but unmistakably clear. Any chronicle that portrayed King Henry as complicit in the archbishop's murder would be considered heretical, and its author subject to charges of treason against both crown and church. The punishment for heresy in medieval England was burning at the stake, a death considered so horrific that many condemned prisoners died of shock before the flames could consume them. But for a monk, there were fates considered worse than physical death. Excommunication would bar Brother Aldrich from the sacraments, condemning his soul to eternal damnation according to church doctrine. Loss of his position would mean exile from the only life he had ever known, cast out to wander as a beggar with no skills suited to the secular world. As he sat in his cell that night, illuminated only by a single candle that cast dancing shadows across his writing desk, Brother Aldrich wrestled with a choice that would define his remaining years. Through his window, he could see the cathedral where Becket had died, its stones still bearing faint stains that no amount of scrubbing had been able to remove. The martyred archbishop seemed to watch him from the darkness, a silent witness to yet another moment when truth hung in the balance. The next morning, Brother Aldrich began work on a new version of the Chronicle, one that portrayed Henry II as a grieving monarch, shocked and horrified by the unauthorized actions of overzealous knights. Becket's principled stands against royal overreach were reframed as unfortunate misunderstandings, and the complex political maneuvering that had led to the crisis was reduced to a simple tale of miscommunication between two men who had once been friends. Meanwhile, across the vast expanse of ancient China, during the revolutionary reign of Emperor Qin Shi Huang, the systematic rewriting of history reached industrial proportions. The year was 213 BCE, and the newly unified Chinese Empire was undertaking the most comprehensive destruction of historical records in human history. The emperor, paranoid about challenges to his legitimacy and determined to present himself as the first true ruler of China, had ordered the burning of all books except those dealing with practical subjects like medicine and agriculture. Li Wei, a court scribe who had previously served the conquered state of Zhao, found himself at the center of this cultural holocaust. For months, he had watched wagon loads of scrolls and bamboo strips arrive at the imperial palace from across the empire. Chronicles of ancient dynasties, philosophical treatises, poetry collections, historical records dating back centuries. All of it was fed to great bonfires that burned for days, their smoke visible from miles away like a funeral pyre for Chinese civilization itself. But the emperor's ambitions extended beyond mere destruction. He wanted new histories written, chronicles that would present his Qin dynasty not as newcomers who had conquered existing states, but as the rightful heirs to a unified China that had always been destined to exist. Previous dynasties were to be portrayed as mere regional governors who had temporarily administered parts of the empire until the true emperor could claim his throne. Li Wei's specific assignment was to rewrite the military history of the Warring States period, transforming centuries of complex interstate conflict into a simple narrative of inevitable unification under Qin leadership. States that had actually been conquered through brutal campaigns involving millions of casualties were to be described as voluntarily joining the empire after recognizing the emperor's superior virtue. Diplomatic marriages that had been desperate attempts to avoid annihilation were reframed as eager alliances sealed by grateful rulers happy to serve the true Son of Heaven. The emperor's methods for ensuring compliance were characteristically direct. In a single day, he had ordered the execution of 460 scholars who possessed unauthorized historical knowledge, burying them alive in mass graves as a warning to others who might be tempted to preserve inconvenient truths. Their deaths were carefully documented, and their names circulated among the surviving scribal community, not as martyrs to be honored, but as examples of what happened to those who valued the past more than the present dynasty. As Li Wei worked on his assigned fabrications, he could hear the sounds of construction echoing from beyond the palace walls. The building of the Great Wall, that massive fortification project that would cost hundreds of thousands of lives. But in the history he was writing, even this brutal undertaking was transformed into a tale of voluntary and national cooperation, with grateful citizens eagerly contributing their labor to a glorious national defense project. Now, let us return to Amara in her chamber in Thebes, where her next assignment would prove even more morally corrosive than her first. A messenger had arrived bearing sealed orders that would test not just her skill as a scribe, but her willingness to participate in the complete obliteration of a human being from the historical record. Prince Kamwasit, younger brother of Ramesses III, had been caught in treasonous correspondence with Nubian rebels, planning what appeared to be a coordinated uprising against the pharaoh's rule. The evidence was overwhelming. Letters in the prince's own hand promising Nubian allies positions in a new government after Ramesses III's overthrow, detailed maps of palace guard rotations, even plans for the assassination of key royal advisors. Under Egyptian law, such treason was punishable not just by death, but by complete erasure from all official records, a fate considered worse than execution, as it condemned the traitor's soul to wander lost in the afterlife, unable to find its way to the judgment of Osiris. Amara's task was to systematically remove every trace of Prince Kamwasit's existence from the historical record. His name was to be chiseled away from temple walls, scraped off papyrus documents, and replaced wherever possible with additional praise for Ramesses III. Birth records would be altered to show that the pharaoh had only the officially approved number of siblings. Artistic depictions showing the prince in royal ceremonies would be modified to show other figures, or destroyed entirely if modification proved impossible. The work was painstakingly precise and utterly devastating. Each stroke of Amara's chisel felt like a small murder, erasing not just a name but a life, a personality, a human being who had once walked the earth and dreamed of a different future for Egypt. As she worked through the night, surrounded by fragments of limestone that had once borne the prince's cartouche, Amara began to understand the true horror of her profession. She was not simply a recorder of history. She was its executioner, wielding tools that could kill more thoroughly than any sword or poison. And with each assignment, each lie carved into stone or inscribed on papyrus, she was becoming something she had never intended to be: an architect of oblivion, a collaborator in the systematic murder of truth itself. The weight on her shoulders grew heavier with each passing night, and she began to wonder if there would come a moment when the burden of her complicity would become too great to bear. 3 months had passed since Amara's first betrayal of truth, and the young scribe had settled into what she told herself was a necessary rhythm of survival. Each morning, she would wake in her small chamber near the temple complex, wash the persistent ink stains from her fingers, and prepare for another day of crafting elegant lies. She had become disturbingly proficient at her work, her initial hesitation replaced by the mechanical efficiency that comes when the soul learns to step aside while the hands perform their duty. But the gods, it seemed, were not finished testing her resolve. The summons came on a morning when the Nile ran particularly low, its receding waters revealing stretches of muddy riverbank that stank of rotting fish and dying vegetation. Such omens typically meant poor harvests ahead, but the royal astrologers had already prepared proclamations attributing the low flood to the pharaoh's divine wisdom in moderating the river's flow to prevent destructive flooding. Amara had helped write those proclamations, her reed pen dancing across papyrus with lies so smoothly crafted they almost convinced her of their truth. When the temple guard appeared at her door bearing the cartouche of Amenemheb, High Priest Amenesare, Amara felt her carefully constructed composure begin to crack. The high priest was perhaps the second most powerful man in all Egypt, his authority rivaling that of Ramesses III himself. In the complex hierarchy of Egyptian power, pharaohs might claim divine status, but it was the high priest who controlled access to the gods themselves, interpreting divine will and managing the vast temple wealth that kept the kingdom functioning. The journey through the temple complex to Amenemheb's private chambers felt like a descent into the underworld. Amara passed through corridors lined with towering columns carved in the shape of lotus flowers, their stone petals seeming to close around her as she walked deeper into the sacred precincts. The walls bore ancient inscriptions chronicling the deeds of pharaohs stretching back generations. Texts she now knew were likely as fabricated as the documents she had been creating. Amenemhet's private chamber was unlike any space Amara had ever entered. Located deep within the temple's inner sanctum, it was illuminated by carefully placed oil lamps that cast dancing shadows across walls covered in hieroglyphic texts so ancient and sacred that only the highest-ranking priests were permitted to read them. The air was thick with incense, frankincense, and myrrh imported at enormous expense from the distant lands of Punt, and the silence was so complete that Amara could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. The high priest himself was a figure that seemed to embody both divine authority and earthly pragmatism. Tall and gaunt, with the pale skin of someone who spent most of his time in temple shadows, Amenemhet wore the traditional leopard skin of his office over fine linen robes. His eyes, dark and intelligent, seemed to look through Amara rather than at her, as if he were reading the hieroglyphs of her soul with the same casual expertise he brought to ancient texts. "Young scribe," he began, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. "Your work has been exemplary. The pharaoh himself has commented favorably on your recent inscriptions regarding the Sea People's campaign. Your ability to transform mere military necessity into divine triumph suggests talents that should not be wasted on routine temple records." Amara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the chamber's cool air. Praise from such a source was far more terrifying than criticism, for it meant she had proven herself valuable to the very system she had begun to despise. Amenemhet continued, moving to a large cedar table where several papyrus scrolls lay unfurled, their surfaces covered with reports written in the hurried script of military messengers. "There has been unrest in the south. The Nubians, those children who seem perpetually unable to appreciate the blessings of Egyptian rule, have once again forgotten their proper place in the divine order." As he spoke, the high priest's fingers traced the papyrus text with the practiced movements of someone who had spent decades extracting meaning from written words. But Amara noticed something in his touch, a careful avoidance of certain passages, as if some sections of the reports were too contaminated with truth to be handled directly. The situation required decisive action. Amenemhet continued, his tone remaining level despite the growing horror in his words. "Pharaoh Ramesses III, in his infinite wisdom and divine authority, dispatched our most capable generals to restore order. The rebellion has been thoroughly addressed." Through the euphemistic language, Amara began to piece together a picture that made her stomach clench with dread. The unrest in the south had apparently been a coordinated uprising involving several Nubian settlements that had refused to meet their tribute obligations. The decisive action had been a military campaign of stunning brutality designed not just to suppress the rebellion, but to ensure that no similar uprisings would occur for generations to come. As Amenemhet spoke, carefully choosing each word to maintain the fiction that Egyptian rule was both divinely ordained and universally welcomed, Amara learned the truth through what he didn't say. Entire villages had been burned. Men, women, and children had been slaughtered not in battle, but in systematic executions designed to terrorize surviving populations into absolute submission. The Nile had reportedly run red with blood for 3 days downstream from the worst massacres, and vultures had grown so fat on human carrion that they could barely fly. The scale of the atrocity was breathtaking, but what truly horrified Amara was the efficiency with which it was being transformed into propaganda. Already, Temple artisans were preparing reliefs that would show Ramesses III accepting the grateful submission of Nubian chieftains, their faces radiating joy at being permitted to serve Egyptian greatness. Court poets were composing hymns celebrating the pharaoh's merciful restraint in dealing with the southern province's temporary confusion. Your task, young scribe, will be to draft the official proclamation regarding these southern events. Amenemheb explained, unfurling a fresh sheet of papyrus with movements that seemed almost ceremonial. The document will describe how a minor disturbance, caused by the misguided actions of a handful of criminals, was swiftly resolved through the pharaoh's divine wisdom and the loyal service of Egyptian forces. There were, naturally, minimal casualties, and the grateful population has renewed their pledges of eternal loyalty to the throne. The reed pen felt impossibly heavy in Amara's hands as she stared at the blank papyrus. This was not like her previous assignments, sanitizing military defeats or inflating routine victories. This was the complete erasure of mass murder, the transformation of genocide into a tale of benevolent governance. Every word she wrote would be another shovelful of earth over the graves of thousands of innocent people. For hours after returning to her quarters, Amara sat motionless in her chair, the unwritten proclamation spread before her like an accusation. Through her window, she could see the Nile flowing northward toward the sea, its waters carrying with them the silt that made Egypt's agriculture possible. But now she couldn't help wondering what else those waters might be carrying from the southern provinces. The ethical calculus that had allowed her to rationalize previous compromises no longer functioned. She could tell herself that inflated military reports were harmless vanity, or that erasing a treacherous prince from records was justified by his genuine crimes. But this was asking her to become complicit in hiding atrocities so vast that they challenge her understanding of what civilized people were capable of inflicting upon one another. As the night deepened and the oil in her lamp burned low, Amara made a decision that she knew might cost her everything she had worked to achieve. If she was going to participate in this monstrous deception, she would ensure that somewhere, somehow, the truth survived alongside the lie. Working by the fading light of her lamp, she prepared 2 documents. The first was the official proclamation Amenemheb had requested, a masterpiece of euphemistic language that transformed massacre into mercy and described the Southern campaign as a minor police action necessitated by criminal elements. Her skill with hieroglyphic script had never been more evident, as she crafted phrases that would satisfy the high priest while revealing nothing of the horror they concealed. But simultaneously, using precious papyrus she had been saving for personal correspondence, Amara wrote a second document. This one detailed everything she had learned about the Southern campaign. The scale of the killings, the deliberate targeting of civilian populations, the systematic destruction of villages, and the calculated terror campaign designed to prevent future resistance. She wrote names of settlements that had been erased from the earth, described the mockery trials that had preceded mass executions, and documented the orders that had explicitly called for the extermination of entire bloodlines to prevent vengeance. When both documents were complete, Amara carefully sealed the truthful account in a ceramic jar, along with a brief explanation of why she had felt compelled to preserve this record. She hid the jar behind a loose stone in her chamber wall, hoping that someday, perhaps years or decades hence, someone would discover it and learn what had really happened in the southern provinces during the reign of Ramesses III. But her act of conscience had not gone unobserved. Katie, a fellow scribe whose ambitions had been frustrated by Amara's rapid advancement, had been watching her activities with growing suspicion. When he noticed her working unusually late into the night and observed the careful way she had hidden something in her wall, his loyalty to the temple hierarchy overcame whatever collegiality he might have felt toward a fellow scribe. The soldiers came for Amara before dawn, their bronze-tipped spears gleaming in the early light as they surrounded her modest dwelling. They gave her no opportunity to speak, no chance to explain or defend herself. Within moments, she was bound and dragged through the temple complex, past the same lotus columns that had seemed so beautiful during her journey to meet the high priest, toward the underground cells reserved for those who had committed offenses against the divine order. The cell they threw her into was a creation of deliberate misery, a stone box barely large enough for a person to lie down, with walls that wept moisture and air that tasted of fear and desperation. In the absolute darkness, Amara could hear the scurrying of rats and the distant moans of other prisoners, their voices echoing through the stone corridors like the complaints of the damned. As she huddled in that terrible darkness, her body already aching from the stone floor and her throat burning with thirst, Amara found herself thinking not of her own fate, but of the thousands of people whose deaths she had been asked to hide. In that moment of ultimate crisis, she realized that her choice had been inevitable from the moment she first took up a reed pen with dreams of preserving truth for posterity. Picture her there now, in that damp and fetid darkness, her dreams of serving history transformed into the stark reality of what happens when conscience collides with power. The girl who had once imagined herself as a chronicler of Egypt's glory had become something she never intended, a witness to its darkest crimes and a participant in their concealment. Yet even in her terror, even facing the very real possibility of torture and death, Amara felt something she hadn't experienced since her first day of scribal training. A sense of her own integrity returned. She had finally written the truth, even if it might cost her everything. As you settle into your own peaceful darkness this evening, let Amara's courage linger in your thoughts, a reminder that in every age, there come moments when we must choose between comfortable lies and dangerous truths, between survival and integrity, between the approval of the powerful and the whispered gratitude of history itself. As Amara languished in her stone cell beneath the temple of Moniasare, her desperate act of hidden truth-telling echoed across the vast expanse of human history like ripples spreading from a stone cast into still water. For her story was not unique to ancient Egypt, nor limited to the particular cruelties of pharaonic rule. Across continents and centuries, in civilizations that would rise long after the pyramids had already stood for millennia, scribes would face the same soul-crushing choice between survival and integrity, between the comfortable lies that preserved their lives and the dangerous truths that honored their humanity. Let your mind drift now across these broader currents of human experience, where the written word became simultaneously humanity's greatest tool for preserving wisdom and its most effective weapon for destroying inconvenient realities. In every corner of the ancient world, in courts both magnificent and modest, the same drama played out with depressing regularity. Power demanded that history serve its interests, and those who held the stylus, quill, or brush found themselves transformed from chroniclers into accomplices. In the marble halls of imperial Rome, where the echoes of senators' speeches mingled with the whispered plots of ambitious generals, a historian named Gaius Cornelius Tacitus faced his own version of Amara's dilemma. The year was 115 CE, and the Emperor Trajan had just returned from his campaigns in Dacia, laden with gold and trailing thousands of enslaved prisoners. The Senate had voted him a triumph. The crowds had cheered his procession through the streets, and the court historians had been commissioned to immortalize his achievements for posterity. But Tacitus, whose keen eye had witnessed the realities behind Rome's imperial glory, struggled with the gap between public celebration and private truth. He had seen the dispatches that never reached the Senate, documents describing the systematic torture of captured Dacian nobles who had refused to reveal the locations of their treasure hoards. He knew about the deliberate destruction of Dacian temples and the forced relocation of entire populations to prevent future resistance. Most troubling of all, he was aware of the emperor's private doubts about the campaign's strategic value, doubts that contradicted the narrative of inevitable Roman triumph being carved into triumphal arches across the empire. Writing during what would later be called the height of Roman civilization, Tacitus developed an almost supernatural ability to tell the truth through misdirection and implication. His accounts of imperial excesses were masterpieces of subtle subversion, appearing to praise while actually condemning, seeming to celebrate while quietly mourning. When describing the conquest of Britain under previous emperors, he wrote of Roman forces creating a wasteland and calling it peace, a phrase that appeared to glorify Roman efficiency while actually indicting the brutality of imperial expansion. His survival depended on this delicate balance. Emperors like Trajan, while more reasonable than predecessors like Caligula or Nero, still maintained networks of informers who monitored literary output for signs of disloyalty. Writers who crossed the line too obviously simply disappeared, their works confiscated and their names added to the growing list of those who had chosen poorly between truth and survival. Meanwhile, in the sun-baked courts of Damascus and Baghdad, where the desert winds carried both the scent of spices from distant lands and the whispered fears of those who served the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphs, scribes faced their own particular form of literary terrorism. Abd al-Rahman ibn Khalil, a court chronicler serving Caliph Harun al-Rashid in 803 CE, found himself tasked with an assignment that would test both his scholarly integrity and his Islamic faith. The caliph, despite his later reputation as the enlightened ruler featured in the 1001 Nights, was deeply insecure about his family's claim to leadership of the Islamic world. His ancestors had seized power through political maneuvering and military force. But legitimacy in Islamic society required demonstrable dissent from the Prophet Muhammad or his companions. The historical record, however, was frustratingly honest about the Abbasids' actual origins as ambitious merchants and minor officials who had skillfully exploited political chaos to advance their own interests. Abd al-Rahman's assignment was to clarify the genealogical records, transforming the caliph's merchant ancestors into heroic companions of the Prophet, their commercial success reframed as rewards for early conversion to Islam and faithful service to the nascent Muslim community. The work required not just creative writing, but the systematic alteration of existing documents and the creation of fictional eyewitness accounts that would support the new narrative. The penalty for refusal was death by beheading, carried out publicly in the courtyard of the Great Mosque as a lesson to other scholars who might be tempted to prioritize historical accuracy over political convenience. But perhaps even more terrifying was the religious dimension of the threat. By refusing the caliph's commission, Abd al-Rahman risked being branded as an enemy of Islam itself, his execution justified as the elimination of someone who had dared to question divinely ordained authority. As he worked through the night in his lamplit study, surrounded by the astronomical instruments and mathematical texts that had made Baghdad the intellectual center of the Islamic world, Abd al-Rahman crafted fictional genealogies with the same precision he applied to calculating celestial movements. Each fabricated connection to the Prophet's family was a small betrayal of the historical method he had spent his life perfecting. Yet each lie potentially saved not just his own life, but those of his wife and children, who would have faced slavery or death if he had been condemned for treason. In the temple complexes of classical India, where the monsoon rains drummed against stone carvings of dancing gods and mathematical concepts that would not reach Europe for centuries. Scholars faced their own version of this eternal conflict. During the reign of Chandragupta II in the early 5th century CE, court astronomer Varahamihira found himself caught between scientific observation and religious orthodoxy in ways that would have been familiar to Galileo a millennium later. The Brahmin priests who controlled religious education had developed elaborate cosmological models based on sacred texts, describing a universe with the Earth supported by cosmic serpents and surrounded by layers of celestial spheres. These models were considered divinely revealed truth, integral to Hindu religious practice and social order. But Varahamihira's careful observations of planetary movements and star positions revealed mathematical patterns that contradicted the priestly cosmology in fundamental ways. When the king commissioned a comprehensive astronomical text that would demonstrate the superiority of Indian knowledge to foreign visitors from China and Persia, Varahamihira faced an impossible choice: publish his accurate observations and face accusations of heresy that could result in exile from the scholarly community and loss of royal patronage, or compromise his scientific integrity to preserve religious harmony. His solution was a masterwork of careful ambiguity. The text he produced contained layers of meaning, surface descriptions that satisfied religious authorities, while embedding mathematical relationships that careful readers could decode to understand the true nature of planetary motion. Future astronomers would spend centuries unraveling the coded truths he had hidden within apparently orthodox religious descriptions. His survival strategy becoming a blueprint for scholars across cultures who faced similar pressures. Even in the rainforests of Mesoamerica, where Maya scribes worked by torchlight in limestone palaces decorated with intricate calendrical calculations, the same deadly dynamic played out between truth and power. In the city-state of Copan during the 8th century CE, the scribe known to us only as Serpent Scroll, his Maya name lost to time, served the ruler 18 Rabbit, whose military campaigns had brought the city unprecedented wealth and territorial expansion. But 18 Rabbit's success had come at a terrible cost that contradicted the divine mandate claimed by Maya kings. Rather than the effortless victories attributed to supernatural intervention, the conquest had required brutal siege warfare that decimated civilian populations. Cities that had surrendered peacefully were nevertheless sacked to terrorize other potential enemies. Prisoners taken in battle were subjected to elaborate torture rituals that served political rather than religious purposes, their prolonged suffering designed to break the will of enemy populations. Serpent Scroll's commission was to create a comprehensive codex celebrating the king's achievements, complete with hieroglyphic inscriptions that would be carved into stone monuments throughout the realm. The work was expected to present 18 Rabbit as a semi-divine figure whose military success demonstrated the god's favor and justified the expansion of royal power over every aspect of Maya society. The consequences of producing an insufficiently flattering account were demonstrated regularly in Copan's Central Plaza, where scribes who had disappointed their royal patrons were burned alive alongside their offending manuscripts. The Maya believed that knowledge and its creator were mystically connected. Destroying both together ensured that dangerous ideas could not contaminate future generations. Yet even facing such absolute consequences, some scribes found ways to preserve fragments of truth. In monastery scriptoriums across medieval Europe, where monks labored to copy both sacred texts and secular chronicles, a tradition of resistance developed that would echo through centuries. These religious scribes, theoretically bound by vows of obedience to ecclesiastical authority, discovered that the very marginalia they added to illuminate manuscripts could serve as hiding places for suppressed information. Brother Thomas of Canterbury, working in the Abbey of Christ Church during the reign of King John in the early 13th century, became a master of this subtle art of historical preservation. While his official chronicle praised the king's efforts to defend England against French invasion and portrayed his conflicts with the Pope as necessary assertions of royal dignity, the decorative borders and margins of his manuscripts told a very different story. Hidden within elaborate illustrations of biblical scenes, coded in the positioning of ornamental letters, embedded in seemingly innocent commentary on scriptural passages, Brother Thomas preserved accounts of King John's systematic extortion of wealthy subjects, his cowardly flight from French forces, and his brutal suppression of baronial opposition. Future readers who knew how to interpret his visual language could reconstruct an accurate picture of one of England's most disastrous reigns, even while the main text sang hymns of royal virtue. This tradition of hidden truth-telling became a lifeline for historical accuracy across cultures and centuries. In China, during the Ming Dynasty's systematic suppression of record from the previous Yuan period, court historians developed elaborate systems of double meaning that allowed them to preserve forbidden information within apparently orthodox texts. Islamic chroniclers under various caliphates created similar methods for encoding criticism of rulers while maintaining surface compliance with imperial demands. These acts of quiet rebellion, like Amara's hidden scroll sealed in its ceramic jar, represented something profoundly important in human history. They were proof that even under the most oppressive circumstances, some individuals would risk everything to ensure that truth survived alongside officially sanctioned lies. These scribes became unsung heroes of human memory, their courage measured not in dramatic gestures of defiance, but in the patient, dangerous work of preserving accurate records for future generations who might never know their names. As you rest now in the comfort of your own evening, consider the debt we owe to these forgotten guardians of truth. Every honest historical account we possess, every accurate record of past events that contradicts official propaganda, represents a victory won by scribes who chose integrity over survival. Their hidden scrolls and coded marginalia, their subtle implications and careful ambiguities, created an alternative historical record that runs parallel to the official narratives carved in stone and preserved in palace archives. In Amara's darkened cell, as rats scurried across stone floors and the weight of her choices pressed down like the limestone blocks above her head, she had become part of this ancient fellowship of truth-tellers. Her hidden account of the Southern massacres, sealed away from the light, but preserved for posterity, joined countless other acts of documentary courage that spanned the globe and stretched across millennia. Whether she would survive to see her truth vindicated remained to be seen, but her courage had already achieved something that transcended personal survival. She had ensured that somewhere, somehow, the real story would endure. The transition from theoretical analysis to brutal reality comes with crushing finality in Amara's story. Where the previous section explored the sophisticated survival strategies employed by scribes across cultures, Tacitus's subtle subversion, Abd al-Rahman's genealogical fabrications, Varahamihara's coded astronomy, Amara's fate represents the stark consequences awaiting those who failed to navigate these treacherous waters successfully. Her story serves as both culmination and cautionary tale, demonstrating that for all the clever wordplay and hidden meanings that allowed some truth-tellers to survive, the fundamental power dynamic remained unchanged. Rulers possessed absolute authority over both life and historical narrative. Amara's fate was sealed in the court of Ramesses III, but the mechanisms that led to her downfall illuminate the sophisticated surveillance systems that ancient authoritarian regimes developed to monitor and control historical narratives. The discovery of her hidden scroll was not accidental. It represented the culmination of a systematic investigation that reveals how seriously ancient rulers took the control of information. In the shadow-filled corridors of the pharaoh's palace, where hieroglyphic inscriptions proclaimed eternal divine rule, and where the very walls seemed to whisper of absolute power, networks of informants operated with deadly efficiency. Temple scribes reported on their colleagues' private conversations. Servants eavesdropped on scholars' debates, and even family members were encouraged to report suspicious activities that might threaten royal authority. The high priest who condemned Amara was not merely a religious figure, but the head of an intelligence apparatus that understood truth itself as a weapon that could destabilize the cosmic order upon which pharaonic power rested. The accusation of treason and sacrilege reveals the sophisticated ideological framework that ancient rulers used to criminalize historical accuracy. By conflating political criticism with religious heresy, the pharaoh's court transformed Amara's documentation of military failures into an attack on divine order itself. This was not merely about suppressing embarrassing information. It was about maintaining a worldview in which royal power was literally sacred, where questioning the pharaoh's decisions was equivalent to challenging the gods themselves. The punishment chosen for Amara, burial alive in a sealed tomb, carried symbolic weight that extended far beyond simple execution. In Egyptian religious belief, proper burial rituals were essential for the soul's journey to the afterlife. By denying Amara these rites and sealing her in darkness with her forbidden knowledge, the court was attempting to eliminate not just her physical presence, but her spiritual existence as well. The message was clear. Those who challenged official truth would be erased not just from life, but from eternity itself. Amara's story was not unique, and the systematic nature of state violence against truth-telling scribes reveals a disturbing pattern that transcended cultural boundaries. In ancient Persia, under Darius I's administration of the vast Achaemenid Empire, the scribe Zervan faced execution for refusing to alter genealogical records, a refusal that had profound political implications in a society where legitimacy depended on demonstrable noble lineage. The Persian case illuminates how seemingly technical historical work carried life-or-death political significance. Genealogical records were not mere family histories, but legal documents that determined inheritance rights, political alliances, and succession claims. When Zervan refused to falsify a rival's lineage, he was not simply being stubborn about historical accuracy. He was effectively blocking a political maneuver that could have shifted the balance of power within the empire's complex aristocratic hierarchy. The method of Zervan's execution, impalement on a stake, was chosen for its public visibility and prolonged suffering. Persian authorities wanted his death to serve as a comprehensive deterrent, demonstrating to other scribes that the consequences of defying imperial demands extended far beyond quick execution. The slow, agonizing death by impalement, carried out in public view, sent an unmistakable message about the value the state placed on historical compliance versus individual integrity. Medieval Japan's treatment of scribes during the Kamakura period reveals how these same dynamics operated within completely different cultural frameworks. The shogun's demand for historical revision was rooted in the samurai code of honor, where military reputation determined not just personal status, but the legitimacy of political authority. When a scribe documented military failures honestly, he threatened the fundamental basis of warrior class rule. The forced seppuku imposed on the Japanese scribe carried additional layers of meaning within samurai culture. By requiring ritual suicide rather than simple execution, the authorities were perversely offering the scribe a chance to restore honor through his death, as if the act of truth-telling had been shameful rather than courageous. The stripping of family honor that accompanied this punishment reveals how state terror extended beyond individual victims to encompass entire kinship networks, ensuring that the consequences of defying official narratives would reverberate through generations. Yet even in the face of such systematic oppression, the human impulse to preserve historical truth proved remarkably resilient. The hidden scrolls discovered by archaeologists represent something far more significant than individual acts of defiance. They reveal the existence of an underground network of truth preservation that operated across cultures and centuries, a secret tradition that understood historical accuracy as worth dying for. These archaeological discoveries illuminate the sophisticated methods that ancient scribes developed for concealing forbidden knowledge. The ceramic jars found in Egyptian tomb walls were not randomly chosen hiding places, but carefully selected repositories that took advantage of religious taboos and construction techniques to ensure long-term preservation. The scribes who created these hidden archives understood materials science, religious practices, and architectural principles well enough to create time capsules that could survive millennia. The temple wall caches represent perhaps the most audacious form of truth preservation. By hiding forbidden scrolls within the very monuments designed to proclaim official propaganda, these scribes created a form of historical irony that would only be appreciated by future generations. The walls that celebrated pharaonic victories simultaneously concealed evidence of defeats, creating a kind of architectural dialogue between official lies and suppressed truths. Similar patterns emerged across cultures. In Mesopotamian ruins, archaeologists have discovered cuneiform tablets hidden beneath temple foundations, preserving accounts of natural disasters and military defeats that contradicted official records. Chinese archaeological sites have yielded bamboo scrolls buried in private residences, containing historical narratives that challenged imperial versions of dynastic transitions. The global nature of these discoveries suggests that the preservation of suppressed truth represented a universal human impulse that transcended specific cultural contexts. The systematic violence directed against truth-telling scribes reveals the profound threat that accurate historical records posed to ancient power structures. These were not arbitrary acts of tyrannical cruelty, but calculated policies designed to maintain political stability through information control. Understanding why rulers considered historical accuracy so dangerous illuminates the fundamental relationship between truth, power, and social order that continues to shape political dynamics today. Ancient legitimacy often rested on carefully constructed narratives about divine favor, military invincibility, and natural superiority. These stories were not merely propaganda, but the foundational myths that justified existing power structures and social hierarchies. When scribes documented evidence that contradicted these narratives, military defeats, natural disasters interpreted as divine displeasure, or the humble origins of supposedly noble dynasties, they threatened the ideological framework that held entire civilizations together. The rulers who ordered these executions understood something that modern observers sometimes miss. In pre-modern societies, where literacy was limited and information traveled slowly, those who controlled written records possessed enormous power to shape collective memory and social understanding. A single honest account of royal failure, if widely circulated, could undermine decades of carefully constructed propaganda and potentially inspire rebellions or succession challenges. This explains why the punishments for historical honesty were often more severe than those for conventional crimes. Military desertion, theft, or even murder might result in execution, but the systematic torture and public humiliation reserved for truth-telling scribes reflected the unique threat they posed to political stability. These elaborate punishments served multiple purposes: eliminating the immediate threat, deterring future acts of historical honesty, and demonstrating the state's absolute authority over truth itself. Amara's whispered vow that truth would outlast her represents more than individual defiance. It embodies a fundamental faith in the ultimate power of historical accuracy that has sustained countless generations of scribes, historians, and journalists who faced similar choices between survival and integrity. Her story connects directly to the broader narrative of truth preservation explored in the previous analysis, showing how individual acts of courage contributed to the larger Underground Railroad of historical accuracy. The broken reed clutched in her dying hands becomes a symbol of the tools of truth-telling themselves. Fragile, easily destroyed, but capable of creating records that could outlast the mightiest empires. Like the hidden scrolls of Brother Thomas in medieval Canterbury or the coded astronomical observations of Varamihira in classical India. Amara's final act of defiance represented a bet on the future, a faith that future generations would value truth enough to seek it out and preserve it. Her fate and that of her fellow truth-tellers across cultures demonstrates that the struggle between official narratives and historical accuracy was never simply about past events. It was about the fundamental question of who gets to control collective memory and shape social understanding. These ancient scribes were fighting the same battle that journalists, historians, and documentary activists fight today, risking everything to ensure that suppressed truths survive alongside officially sanctioned lies. The archaeological discoveries that occasionally bring their hidden scrolls to light serve as vindication of their sacrifice, proof that their whispered vows were not made in vain. Each ceramic jar unearthed from temple walls, each coded manuscript decoded by patient scholars, represents a victory for the principle that truth, however dangerous to those in power, deserves preservation for future generations who might be wise enough to learn from it. The most tragic aspect of the scribe's struggle may be how completely their sacrifices vanished from collective memory. As centuries passed, the very records these individuals died trying to preserve truthfully became buried beneath officially sanctioned mythology. The chronicles of pharaohs, emperors, and kings, those polished narratives that scribes were forced to write at the cost of their integrity and often their lives, became the official history that would shape human understanding for millennia. This erasure was not accidental, but represented the ultimate victory of the power structures these scribes had resisted. By forgetting their struggles, later generations could consume historical narratives with comfortable naivety, never questioning the circumstances under which these seemingly authoritative accounts were created. Yet even as their true stories disappeared, the myth of the scribe as a neutral recorder persisted with remarkable tenacity, much like the romanticized pirate of later tales. This mythologization allowed later civilizations to maintain faith in historical objectivity while avoiding uncomfortable questions about how records were actually created. In modern culture, we imagine ancient scribes as quiet scholars in peaceful scriptoriums, their greatest concerns being accurate spelling and legible handwriting. This romanticized vision depicts them as detached observers, carefully recording events with scientific objectivity. The image persists in museums and textbooks. The wise scribe, perhaps elderly and bearded, surrounded by scrolls, serving as humanity's faithful memory keeper. This comfortable mythology obscures the harsh reality that these individuals were employees of power structures demanding specific historical narratives. The peaceful scriptoriums we imagine were often surveillance environments where colleagues informed on each other, where every written word faced political review and where wrong phrasing could result in immediate imprisonment or execution. The reality was far grimmer. Ancient scribes were not neutral observers, but pawns in elaborate games of power, their words weaponized to shape legacies and control narratives with the same strategic calculation rulers applied to military campaigns. Their pens became instruments of warfare. Their scrolls battlefields where competing versions of reality fought for supremacy. This weaponization operated on multiple levels. Military defeats could be transformed into strategic withdrawals, economic disasters reframed as temporary challenges overcome by royal wisdom, and popular rebellions described as isolated disturbances quickly suppressed by divine intervention. But deeper manipulation involved systematically reshaping collective memory itself, rewriting genealogies to legitimize questionable succession claims, modifying ancient treaties to support territorial ambitions, and erasing entire peoples from historical records. The scribes who participated in this process, whether willingly or under coercion, became complicit in crimes against historical memory that would echo across generations. Their falsified records would justify future wars. Their fabricated genealogies would support new claims to power, and their revised chronicles would become foundations for legal systems oppressing millions who never knew of the original deceptions. Their lives were marked by constant psychological toll. Fear permeated every aspect of their existence. Fear of writing something that might displease patrons, fear of being caught in errors that could be interpreted as subversion, fear of colleagues who might report suspicious activities. The coercion included economic dependence, social isolation, and professional ostracism awaiting those who failed to demonstrate sufficient enthusiasm for official narratives. Despite overwhelming pressures, their subtle acts of resistance, hidden texts, coded messages, carefully preserved alternative narratives, created a legacy of defiance that continues inspiring those who discover their courage centuries later. These acts were not grand gestures, but small, careful preservation efforts requiring sustained courage over years or decades. The sophistication of their resistance networks reveals deep commitment to historical truth despite personal costs. Archaeological evidence suggests scribes across different cultures developed remarkably similar preservation methods, indicating either direct communication between resistance networks or independent evolution of similar techniques driven by similar pressures. The coded messages they embedded in official documents represent steganography, hiding messages within other messages, requiring not only courage but considerable technical skill. These scribes mastered writing text that would satisfy overseers while simultaneously preserving accurate information for future readers who might decode their hidden meanings. Their legacy reminds us that even facing death, some individuals dared protect historical truth, establishing precedents that continue inspiring journalists, historians, and documentary activists facing similar pressures in contemporary authoritarian contexts. The techniques they developed for preserving suppressed information have been adapted by modern resistance movements, while their moral example guides those choosing between personal safety and historical integrity. Modern investigative journalists under authoritarian regimes employ methods familiar to ancient scribes. Coded language passing official censorship while conveying accurate information, hidden archives preserving evidence for future revelation, and collaborative networks ensuring information survival even if individual truth-tellers are silenced. The digital age provides new preservation tools but creates new vulnerabilities ancient scribes never faced. Electronic records can be altered without physical traces, while digital surveillance allows modern authoritarian regimes to monitor information flows with unprecedented precision. In this context, analog techniques developed by ancient scribes, physical hiding places, coded paper documents, face-to-face networks, have gained renewed relevance for preserving truth in hostile environments. As you drift off tonight, spare a thought for Amara, clutching her broken reed as limestone blocks sealed her fate, for Zervan impaled on Persian stakes for refusing to falsify genealogies, and for countless unnamed scribes whose names were deliberately erased by the systems they served. They were not traditional heroes, not warriors who won glorious battles or leaders who inspired nations, but flawed, frightened humans caught in impossible circumstances who made choices honoring something larger than their own survival. Their stories, like faint scratches of their quills on papyrus and parchment, whisper across millennia with urgently relevant messages. They urge us to question inherited histories, seek truths buried beneath official narratives, and remember that every historical record represents choices made by individuals who faced real consequences for their decisions about truth and falsehood. These whispers remind us that historical truth is not a natural phenomenon, but a human achievement requiring constant vigilance and occasional sacrifice. The comfortable assumption that accurate records emerge automatically dissolves when we understand the circumstances under which most historical documents were actually created. The responsibility for preserving and seeking historical truth falls not on abstract institutions, but on individuals who must choose, moment by moment, whether to prioritize personal safety or collective memory. In our age of information warfare and alternative facts, these ancient truth-tellers become more relevant than ever. Their struggles remind us that the battle for historical accuracy is not modern, but an eternal human challenge requiring the same courage from each generation. Their legacy whispers across time, urging us to take up the broken reeds they dropped and continue the never-ending work of preserving truth for those who will come after us. Our journey through the treacherous world of ancient scribes has revealed a stark and unsettling truth that reverberates through every page of human history. The written record is not a neutral chronicle of events, but a contested battleground where truth and power have waged eternal warfare. From Amara's hidden scroll sealed beneath Egyptian limestone to the coded marginalia of medieval monks scratching subversive messages into illuminated manuscripts, scribes across cultures and centuries face the same brutal ultimatum: rewrite history to serve power or face erasure themselves. This grim choice was not an anomaly of particularly tyrannical regimes, but a fundamental feature of how historical knowledge has been created and preserved throughout human civilization. The evidence we have examined spans continents and millennia, from the courts of Ramesses III to the scriptoriums of Canterbury, from the astronomical observatories of classical India to the palace libraries of medieval Japan. In each case, we find the same dynamic. Those who control political power understood instinctively that controlling historical narrative was essential to maintaining their authority, and they were willing to use extreme violence to enforce that control. The most disturbing revelation of our investigation is how universal these patterns prove to be. The struggle between truth and power that we witnessed in ancient Egypt was not unique to pharaonic culture, but emerged independently in every complex civilization that developed writing systems. Whether scribes worked with cuneiform tablets in Mesopotamia, brush and ink in China, or quill and parchment in medieval Europe, they found themselves subject to the same fundamental pressures that transformed them from neutral recorders into unwilling participants in elaborate deceptions. This universality suggests something profound about the relationship between literacy, political power, and social control. Writing systems themselves, regardless of their technical characteristics, created new possibilities for both preserving truth and manufacturing lies. The same skills that allowed scribes to document accurate accounts of military campaigns also enabled them to fabricate genealogies that legitimized questionable successions. The same careful attention to detail that made them valuable as record keepers also made them dangerous as potential witnesses to official misconduct. The consistency of these patterns across cultures indicates that the pressures ancient scribes faced were not accidental byproducts of particularly corrupt regimes, but inevitable consequences of literacy's role in complex societies. Once writing became a tool for governance, those who controlled governments would naturally seek to control writing itself, turning scribes into instruments of state policy rather than independent chroniclers of events. The systematic nature of scribal oppression reveals sophisticated understanding of information warfare that predates modern concepts by millennia. Ancient rulers and their advisors grasped intuitively that controlling written records was not simply about suppressing embarrassing information, but about shaping the fundamental assumptions that future generations would use to understand reality itself. Their lives were marked by layers of surveillance and control that extended far beyond simple censorship. Temple complexes and palace scriptoriums operated as panopticons where scribes could never be certain who was observing their work or reporting their conversations. The psychological pressure of constant monitoring was amplified by the knowledge that colleagues might be informants, creating an atmosphere of perpetual anxiety that made independent thought increasingly difficult to maintain. The terror was both personal and professional, targeting not just individual scribes, but entire networks of family members, students, and collaborators who might be implicated in acts of historical honesty. This collective punishment ensured that the consequences of defying official narratives extended far beyond the individual making the choice, creating additional pressure to comply with demands for historical falsification. The economic dimensions of scribal oppression were equally sophisticated. By controlling access to writing materials, employment opportunities, and patronage networks, authorities could starve potential dissidents into submission without resorting to overt violence. A scribe who lost royal favor might find himself unable to purchase papyrus or parchment, excluded from scholarly communities, and reduced to poverty as punishment for insufficient enthusiasm for official narratives. Yet, as we have seen throughout this investigation, the choices faced by ancient scribes were rarely as clear-cut as simple decisions between truth and falsehood. Most found themselves operating in moral gray areas where complete honesty was impossible, but various degrees of compromise might allow them to preserve some accurate information while protecting their own lives and those of their families. The survival strategies they developed, coded language, hidden archives, subtle implications that careful readers might decode, required them to become masters of multiple forms of communication simultaneously. They had to satisfy their overseers with apparently compliant texts while embedding enough accurate information to maintain their scholarly integrity and provide resources for future historians who might be able to piece together more complete accounts. This moral complexity makes their stories more compelling than simple tales of heroic resistance or cowardly collaboration. The scribes we have encountered were neither saints nor villains, but human beings trying to navigate impossible circumstances while preserving whatever fragments of truth they could manage. Their courage was measured not in dramatic gestures of defiance, but in the patient, dangerous work of maintaining intellectual honesty under conditions designed to make such honesty lethal. The psychological toll of this constant moral compromise emerges clearly from the archaeological record. The hidden caches of suppressed documents reveal scribes who understood that their official work was corrupted but refused to abandon completely their commitment to historical accuracy. These secret archives represent acts of faith in future generations who might value truth enough to seek it out and preserve it. Their legacy endures not only in the fragments of suppressed truth they managed to preserve, but in the questions their struggles raise about our own relationship to historical knowledge and information control. The techniques they developed for resisting narrative manipulation have been adapted by modern journalists, historians, and activists who face similar pressures in contemporary authoritarian contexts. The digital age has created new possibilities for both information preservation and suppression that would have been incomprehensible to ancient scribes. Yet the fundamental dynamics they navigated remain unchanged. Modern authoritarian regimes employ sophisticated methods for controlling historical narrative that echo the strategies used by ancient emperors and pharaohs. The tools have evolved, but the underlying struggle between truth and power continues. Understanding how ancient scribes coped with these pressures provides valuable insights for contemporary truth-tellers who must make similar choices between personal safety and historical integrity. Their example reminds us that the preservation of accurate historical records is not a natural process, but a human achievement that requires constant vigilance and occasional sacrifice from each generation that inherits it. As the candlelight of our tale flickers in the gathering darkness, let us remember these scribes not as faceless scholars laboring in dusty libraries, but as courageous, conflicted souls who shaped our understanding of the past while working under the constant shadow of death. Their names may have been deliberately erased from official records, but their influence persists in every honest historical account we possess, every question we ask about inherited narratives, and every act of intellectual courage that chooses truth over convenience. Amara's broken reed, clutched in her dying hands as limestone blocks sealed her tomb, becomes a symbol that transcends her individual tragedy. It represents the fragile but persistent tools that humans have always used to preserve truth against overwhelming opposition. The reed may break, the scribe may die, but the words they managed to preserve, hidden in ceramic jars, coded in manuscript margins, whispered in secret to trusted colleagues, continue to speak across the centuries. Their sacrifice reminds us that historical truth is not a luxury for peaceful times, but a necessity that requires protection, especially when it becomes dangerous to preserve. The comfortable assumption that accurate records emerge naturally from past events dissolves when we understand the circumstances under which most historical documents were actually created. The responsibility for seeking and preserving truth falls not on abstract institutions, but on individuals who must choose, moment by moment and word by word, whether to prioritize personal safety or collective memory. In our own era of information warfare and alternative facts, these ancient truth-tellers become more relevant than ever. Their struggles remind us that the battle for historical accuracy is not a modern phenomenon, but an eternal human challenge that requires the same moral courage from each generation that faces it. Their legacy whispers across time, urging us to take up the broken reeds they dropped and continue the never-ending work of preserving truth for those who will come after us, whatever the personal cost may be.